A lot of the work that we've done up to this point and expect more is to try and open up and in some ways break people's conception of what a library is and what librarians do. We're taking the old nostalgia and we're sort of shifting it and in some cases shattering it. We're moving them from the idea of reading in refuge to the idea of learning and aspiration. We've moved from the idea of just books as a way of doing that to books and makerspaces and all sorts of things. So we've taken people on a pretty interesting ride to this point. But what we're starting to get to the point of deconstructing libraries and breaking apart their preconceived notions and moving and shifting them, we really are at the point where things are beginning to get on loose soil. That it's enough to say, hey, that's not how to think about libraries, but we also have to give them, hey, here's how to think about libraries. We've done that with a little of the mission and the background, but now what we're going to do in chapter 6 is we're really going to try to create some firm footing. We're going to use example after example after example to try and say, look, this is how these ideas and this new idea of librarianship plays out in your library, in your setting. So, where the other chapters talked about different concepts and theories, and we had lots of stories, this one is really, really strong on stories and examples. And so we're going to go through them, talking about how to use them and where they've come. And we begin with talking a little bit about Dewey. Now, Melville Dewey is one of those other things that if pretty much you say anyone you're a librarian or you work in a library, they'll look at you and sort of say, oh, Dewey, because they had to learn it when they were kids or something. And they may or may not know that that was Melville Dewey, and they probably certainly don't know that Melville Dewey was a misogynist and an anti-Semite and all this wonderful stuff, that there's a complexity behind it. But once again, we can use it. Hey, you know Dewey. You need to think a little bit about Dewey. One of the things that Dewey brought to librarianship, and he wasn't alone, obviously, but he certainly typified it, was the idea of efficiency, the idea of creating standards and standardization. We think of that in classification systems, but he was much more about just classification systems. I mean, on the side, he was about the metric system and spelling reformation. But even within libraries, it was standardization, standard services, standard this. Don't make people, if they go to one library, they should know how to use the other. We should be able to make things in sort of spare parts. And today, we think of that as sort of a negative, but at the time, that was the thinking. Dewey was operating around the time of Henry Ford and the production line. We were seeing dramatic increases in productivity out of manufacturing because we were implementing an industrialized, standardized process. And we've seen it applied lots of places, and we've actually seen now 100 plus years on how we're trying to get out of the hole that we dug with it. For example, not only did we apply it to how we make cars and how we organize libraries, we applied it to our educational system. That idea that there is a standard rung of 1 through 12, and this is what students know at each level, and they progress to the next, and we put 30 of them in, and etc., worked really well if you were working and building sort of the same model of car, which really defines itself as the same ethnic and racial and social background. And as we began to expand who public education was for, which wasn't just for white males and white females and suburban and urban, but then the idea of bringing in other races and other religions and then expanding it to other capabilities and people with different learning disabilities, these kinds of things, we've seen that the industrial model begins to break down. Well, we're at the point in libraries where it's also breaking down, where as we try and bring on new features and new functions, as we try and adopt digital technologies, as we try to think about how people learn, we're breaking a traditional model of a bunch of materials in a specific order that's universal, that all people can find it. Right? So we need to tell people just a little bit about that background and get them engaged. So the lasting legacy from Dewey and his group was this idea that it was efficiency over effectiveness. That the way we got people to, the way we did our job well is we did it efficiently. And we almost didn't measure the outcomes. We measured the inputs and the process and the outputs, and we could try and get what was the circulation and circulation per capita and circulation per hour and etc. And now we're getting to the point of, does circulation make a difference? If someone reads a book, does it change how they think about things? So once again, we're moving people to a much more complex view of our industry, but we're also moving ourselves, librarians, administrators, board members, provost, Senate staff, Senate committees, into this new concept as well. So we need to walk them in. And once again, we just spent 5 chapters of challenging that. But now we sort of have this idea, but we begin to now add some concrete footing back in. And the first concept we bring is one that we adopt from computer science, frankly, and information systems, and that's the concept of a platform. Software platform is a set of capabilities, different functions, different programming, etc., that you can pull together, and from that common set of capabilities, build vastly different interfaces and different things. The internet you can think of as a platform. The basis of that platform is how data, ones and zeros, zip across lines and across the air. But from those basics, addressing schema, way data gets in and out of computers, we've been able to build things like apps, and we've been able to build websites, and we've been able to build websites around, cooking, and websites around the US government, and we've built apps to help you date and all of that. That great variety of functionality, that great capability comes from having a common platform. So having the basics, a common, strong, robust set of functions or understandings or commonalities can actually lead to greater diversity and diversification of what you can do with it, as opposed to something which is extraordinarily custom built for only one function. A platform is a baseline that you can build many, many functions off of. And so we're going to walk them through the idea that a library, if it's about learning, that's great. But if it's not about books and stuff and it's about creation, it's confusing. All right, step back. Think of a platform. Think of a platform that a community builds for knowledge creation and sharing. All right, and that platform is going to have certain functions, our ways of facilitating conversations and such. And so we begin talking about things, and I use the example here of an iPhone. The iPhone that we have today is a platform. The iPhone by itself doesn't say how to do Angry Birds and solitaire. Really, it just says how to get data off the internet, make phone calls, and give you a web browser. And as I say here, a lot of this time we think of the iPhone as a platform with lots of different variety, but when it first came out, it was only what Apple allowed you to have on it. It was only when Apple opened up the platform, letting other people develop and use that commonality, that we got the great variety, the great functionality. And so that's a way of thinking about this. So the idea is, yeah, I know libraries aren't just about books and materials and quiet places. They're all these crazy things. But in order to facilitate this crazy read, community-specific ways of doing that, we still need some common platform. It's just not up in front of your face anymore. So we're going to give you some examples. And here's where we begin talking about examples. And frankly, you can read through them. And I want to talk a little bit about why I picked them and how they're useful. But the first thing, sort of an overarching statement, is these platforms are specifically not about any single library type. In other words, I give a public library, I give an academic library, a special library, because the other part of the advocacy that we need to do is not just to the people who use our libraries, but to librarians and the people who support libraries, to understand that those contexts, those communities that we serve are unique. And simply saying that all academic librarians are the same and all academic libraries are the same, that all academic settings are the same and all students are the same. It's not true. We need to, once again, get good ideas, share good ideas, build partnerships across these community types. So I'm start by talking about the community garden, the idea that began by people checking out plant areas to learn how to plant by actually planting in a garden built around a library. Well, there's nothing to say that an academic library couldn't do the same, or a hospital library, where as part of recovery, patients could go out and begin the idea of doing gardening and being out in nature. So these are different examples to show the idea of a platform showing up in many different ways. But to our library communities, it's the fact that good ideas should come from many different places, and we shouldn't restrict them to a given type. So going through the library garden, which is a great, really cool idea and can be expanded out. Talking about reorganizing the research library. So here's where we have to talk about the effect of Dewey. In fact, this certain library, just as a side note, was the Dewey Library, but not after Melville. The Dewey Library in this academic setting, they had a traditional, we have technical services, we have public services, and cataloging goes in technical services and reference goes in public services, and it's all laid out. It's all laid out like every other research library. Like every other research library at this dimension, they're the same. And the question that this person asked within this library director, which was, why? Why? And worse, why is it that technical services and public services, or how we organize our research library, and how we organize a public library that has nothing to do with research, and how we organize a school library, it didn't make sense. And so what this person did was they reoriented the services. Once again, think of that platform, how they were going to roll out the skills of librarians and the resources of librarians, the platform, to meet this specific need. And the answer was not to model it on what other libraries look like, but to model it what this community and organization look like. In this case, a research university. It looked like teaching. It looked like research. It looked like service. It didn't look like technical services and public services. And so this idea that we have a platform, and in this library, it may look like, in this case, teaching and research. And another one, it may be primarily teaching. In another one, it may be primarily reference relief. I've seen many academic libraries where the university is very much sort of separated from town, out in the middle of nowhere. Their academic libraries have strong collections of popular DVDs and popular reading because they are also the public library, if you will. The point is, it looks like the community. Same platform being used in multiple different settings, but each one looking different based on the specific and specific advocacy and aspirations of a given community. So another one here talking about e-science, or really embedded librarianship. And here we have another story. So we want to keep people engaged with different stories. And so here we talk about the idea of a really horrible Johns Hopkins asthma study that led to a death, and then talks about the importance of libraries. In essence, what happened was these researchers identified a drug. They began field testing the drug, and the third person they killed by this drug. And the reason they didn't know this is not because the drug was new, but because when the researchers went and looked in the data, they looked only in digital resources that went back to roughly the mid-'80s. And the initial research on this was done in the 50s and hadn't been digitized yet. And had they gone back to those 50s literature, they would have found exactly what had happened. So it's a pretty dramatic story. It also sort of raises the stakes for libraries. Right? It's not just, oh, it's happy and it's fun and it's learning. It's also, oh, we save lives. Oh, we help discover the universe. Oh, we help people get healthcare. Oh, we help, right? So we want to come back to the idea that this isn't just a positive, all fun, voluntary thing. These have very specific life and death consequences for the communities that we serve. So we have one example here with the drug trial. We have another one here with the Large Hadron Collider. And so we're giving examples, once again, lots of different settings, but at the same time also saying lots of different settings, including really high stakes, important ones that you need to support. And then talking about the idea of public library incubators. Incubators, startup, entrepreneurship, new business, still a very important topic, particularly to municipal leaders. And so here we begin to talk about how we link into this. And I tell the story in Dallas and when Corinne Hill was there. And this is back to the idea of, why do we customize libraries to look very different for different settings? And yet, once again, same platform underneath. In this case, it was the idea that when we build libraries in arts communities, the space can be used for displaying artwork or for openings. If we build them in research settings, they may look like laboratories. If we build them in distributed settings, they may look like a person with a Wi-Fi hotspot in their backpack. But they're still libraries. See, they still connect. They're still about learning. They're still about creation. They're still about the same mission. So we keep bringing this back together. The idea that we don't want to standardize on how they look and how they function. We want to standardize on what they're trying to do and the skills and tasks that we can share and modify for our given community. And then I introduced this concept that the community is the collection. And I introduced this for a couple of reasons. One, because it is. But two, oftentimes when people look at this more community-based approach, when we start talking about communities, when we start talking about how we bring the community in and volunteers and connecting and aspirations, it's really easy for people to begin to think of that as that's a public thing. Oh, that's just about public services. That's just about the front end. That's not about what I do in cataloging. That's not about what I do in the systems development and web development. That's not what I do in interlibrary loan, etc. And what I started using this phrase, the community is your collection, was to make it very clear that in fact, not only was this applicable to people doing cataloging, original and copy cataloging, people building systems, people maintaining IT, but that a lot of what they had learned by doing cataloging and copy cataloging and IT, etc., was directly applicable to how we would do public outreach and service. Not that we would classify everyone and give them Dewey numbers, but the idea that you talk about quality control, you talk about completeness, you talk about, how do you balance different perspectives, you talk about the idea of reaching out and working with the community, that you spend some time on development, etc. So the community as a collection has two things. One, for people to see that what they're really building value in is not the materials, the collections, and the place, but the people in the community. Two, that the community is not simply a matter of users and consumers, sort of empty buckets waiting for us to share them with information and help bring them up, but also that how we work and engage with this community is very much a matter of building processes. And I'll give you a simple example. If someone walked into a branch library, academic, public, special, doesn't matter, and they brought with them a collection of 10 books, and they said, hey, I think these 10 books would be useful to the library. I'm going to get rid of them. I don't need them. I get them for my grandmother's, whatever. Here, do something with them. We wouldn't bat an eye. We'd have a process. We'd look through them. We'd make sure that they were physically okay. Maybe we might have someone in collection development take a look to see if we need them. If it is, we would get them shrink wrapped, we'd get them barcoded, and we'd get them up. We wouldn't even think that that was for a second odd. Right? It's even to the point where if they bring in National Geographics from 1932, we roll our eyes, but we probably have somewhere a speech to give the person about thank you so much. We really don't need more dead paper, right? Now imagine that instead of someone bringing in a bunch of books to give us, they brought in a bunch of authors who wrote books and said, hey, here are my buddies. We'd really like to share what we know with your community. What would you do? Now, you may say, well, that's what most people would say. Or I'd get the director, or I'd get the branch manager, or I'd get so-and-so. But do we have the same sort of process where we bring them in, we identify the value that they have to the community, we identify processes to make that available to the community, and then to assess the impact of making that knowledge, that unique talent available to people? Whether that's in programming, whether that's in collaborative collection development, whether that's in doing an online MOOC, whether that's in doing singing episodes, whatever it is, we have to begin to think about, all right, just like have all these systems and ways of thinking about stuff, we need systems to think about the expertise lying in our community, not just treating them as people who use us and walk away, but treating them as the resource to be shared and connected just like anyone else. And so I give a few examples here. The idea here, for example, Pine Grove Middle School, where Sue Kowalski uses her middle school kids as the collection, in the sense that before she had a problem where all these kids would come in like, I got nothing to do, I want to volunteer at the library. And she found herself spending so much time trying to figure out what they could do to be quote unquote helpful that she wasn't getting the rest of her job done. And it wasn't until she turned around and realized that, in fact, they could do these jobs better than she could, so they can do things like shelve. They can even do things like selecting which books to purchase. Not all of them, but some of them. They can do technical development. They can set up the library for an incoming class. And she can then do more of the work that as a school librarian she should be doing, which is working with faculty and working on information literacy curriculum. And so that's one of those examples that just talk about the idea that for so long we've been treating the community who comes in and volunteers, because that's the equivalent of walking up to the front desk and saying, I'm a resource to share with the community. What do you want to do with me? And she said, for so long we've been doing this wrong. We've been trying to turn them into little mini librarians or pages. And all the effort it takes to do that means it takes away from our other work to, they're the resource. How can we take advantage of what they do? And so middle school, Sue Kowalski talks about, this is the Fayetteville Free Library in New York. And what they did was the same thing. They had a bunch of retirees in a relatively affluent community coming in and saying, we'd like to volunteer. And they would show them how to do things like bookshelves. And then they would help them with the annual book sale. And it just became this rather bit of labor to manage free labor, to the point that it was getting in the way of the paid labor. And they said, wait, we're getting this wrong. These retirees, these people who are coming in to volunteer their time, they were doctors. They were engineers. They were accountants. They were whatever it was, plumbers. They were teachers. Why don't we use their skill to connect to our community? Why don't we build programs around them? In other words, our job is, the volunteer's job is not to help librarians do their work better. The librarian's job is to help the volunteers share what they know. And to do that, they put out this simple 3 questions. What do you love? What are you passionate about? And are you willing to share it with the community? And they found with those 3 things, they could really craft a whole new sets of programs. It turned not only into speaker series, but it turned into one preschool teacher came in and said, I love pre-literacy. We don't do enough preparing kids to read. I have to do that all day in my class. And the librarian said, great, would you get up and give a workshop? And she goes, I have to do that all day in class. I don't want to teach another one. But what she did want to do, and what they helped her do, was she put together these little kits. And in the kit is a lesson plan for a parent, a board book for a toddler, and then some toy that represented a key idea. So one of the key ideas in early literacy is to connect words with physical actions. And so motion. So here's a book on trucks, and here's a toy, and the toy, you roll it down and it comes back to you, kind of thing. And so as you're reading it, and the kid's connecting words and motion, and it creates this whole cycle. And so they created a series of these packets. So her passion was pre-literacy, but the way in which they integrated her expertise into the collection, into the platform that is a library, wasn't by having her speak, but by having her help with collection development and augmentation. By the way, that turned into not only one on early literacy, they have one on electrical engineering with ohms and the whole electrical circuit boards, turned into one on astronomy where you can borrow a telescope, which comes with instructions and materials. It also did turn into, they had yoga story time, where instead of downward duck and such, they were doing growling monster, and people could come in and do yoga with their kids in the middle of story time. And so this whole thing started as not how creative the librarians could be, but how talented was the community, and how could we work with them to expose that talent. It's still a library because we're about building knowledge, and we're a platform for sharing that among the community. So that's once again where we're getting hard specific stories, but we're taking this learning, and we're taking learning beyond books and materials, and we're making it real for people. So suddenly they say, oh, I'm a library board member. I came because I knew you needed an accountant and I could share that. Well, have you ever thought about not just sharing it with the library board, but to sharing it with your community? How could we do that? And so these are just specific examples of now giving the sense of, all right, if we've broken you of this idea of quiet place with lots of books, what we're putting in its place is learning space that looks like your community, not like every other library. This is how it works and how it looks. And of course, we have to take on the big question, which is libraries as place. So right up there with, no, I really do love reading, I have to often say, no, I really do love library buildings when they make sense. I don't think a library has to have a physical facility. I think there are lots of virtual libraries that work very well, that have this platform and have this mission and skills and such, and putting it forward. But there's an important part of having a place, but it's not what it used to be. Having a library used to be where the librarians did their work. That's where librarians could get to their resources and materials and answer questions and provide reading assistance and provide research and provide background. Increasingly, a lot of that work can be done virtually, can be done online. And that can be done without a physical connection, right? It's a hotspot and a backpack. And you can be out there in a faculty member's office. You can be out there in a 3rd grade classroom. You can be out there in a doctor's office. You can be out there in low-income housing. And so what we're seeing is the place that used to be the place where librarians do their work is the library is a place where the community comes and forms a community and shares, and the librarians get the hell out. One of the things we have to say on a regular basis around advocacy is, if you want to do good advocacy, get out of your library. Show the community what you're doing in the community. Meet the needs of people where they need it. The idea that a director is spending a hell of a lot of time in the building means that the director is more worried about how they manage their staff. Okay. But at some point, once they get that in place, they should get out of there. They should be spending time with mayors. They should be spending time with provosts. They should be spending time with faculty. They should be spending time with principals. They should be spending time with teachers. That place is, we need to set it up so it's a place where the library, where the community comes and does cool stuff. And the librarians facilitate that. But on a regular basis, that frees the librarians up to get it out of the space to connect to stakeholders, to connect to new opportunities, and to connect to new organizations. So there it is. So we're beginning now in this chapter to give real specific stories. To say, all right, if you adopt this idea of knowledge, if you adopt this idea of learning, if you adopt this knowledge, libraries are going to look different. And this is how they're going to look. And it's not just because we're crazy and it's a fad. It's not just because 3D printers, let's go after it. It's because we're trying to fulfill this knowledge mission. And so, of course, it's going to look different. And it's going to look different from community to community. And that's okay. I mean, think about it for a moment of the web. When you bring up a website, there was a time when everyone said, oh, all websites must look exactly the same. Really? Or every website in this organization must look exactly like everyone else. Have you noticed as you move from organization to organization, from service to service, from page to page, they don't look at all alike? And yes, some of them are confusing, but really it doesn't mean that you don't know how to use the web. The variety is overcome by common search interfaces, by common web infrastructure, and the variety and diversity that we see when we engage the web and information helps us. It gives us a better appreciation of the people who created it and the communities that are around it. So, common platform allows great variety. Great variety allows great specificity and match to our communities, and that's what we need to do. In our buildings, in our services, and our librarians need to get outside of those buildings to offer those services wherever they're needed. Thank you very much.